Dr. Nick Rose. Welcome to the podcast. Great to be with you once the bloody technology allowed me to log into my own account. But anyway, we are here. Now, mate, we are going to talk about all things food. And you are heavily involved in food systems. So I thought an interesting point to start would be just tell our listeners about your PhD, what you studied in, and then what you do now, and just give us the 5-foot overview of the Nick Rose train.
Great, thanks very much. And yeah, my journey into food is a little bit different, I guess, to a lot of others. I think a lot of people come into working in food systems having worked in hospital or working, training in dietetics or public health nutrition, those kinds of, backgrounds and entry points. For me, it was a little bit different. My first career actually was in law. I was a corporate lawyer briefly. And then a big turning point came in making the decision to go and live in Guatemala in Central
Oh,
America.
wow.
I had been living in the UK for many years after, jettisoning my corporate law degree, my career. Went and lived in the UK for many years in the 1990s, and then made the decision to go and live in Guatemala at the beginning of the year 2000. And that was motivated not by food, but by human rights. And I guess that's kind of like my entry point into this is really from a principled position that access to good food for all people at all times is really and should be seen as a basic human right, something that all of us should be entitled to simply by virtue of the fact that we're humans and we're alive on a planet that is full of abundance and nourishment. So
And why Guatemala,
uh,
Nick?
the time in Guatemala. The time in Guatemala was very formative, Paul. Yeah. My partner at the time and I had in London, we'd been meeting with the coordinator of a Spanish NGO called Las Brigadas de Paz Internacionales, or Peace Brigades International. They were set up in the mid 1980s as wanting to put the idea of human rights into practice in a very physical and material way. That is to say, mobilizing volunteers from from Europe, from Britain, North America, Australia, the global North, essentially, to go and live and work in countries in the global South that were in situations of conflict, of internal armed conflict or civil war. And the theory, the idea that by going and living and working in those situations, you could be making a very significant difference. I had somebody who was, say, Indigenous rights activist or a women's rights group, somebody like that who, because of the work they were doing in the context of the country at that time, put them in tremendous danger.
Right.
And often those people would be experiencing harassment, threats, disappearance, all kinds of risks and dangers, that they were exposing themselves to. And the idea of peace brigades is that someone like myself as an Australian would go and live and work alongside that person, and I would be a witness, an observer, and my physical presence would be a deterrent to the bad guys from actually following through on their threats.
That's interesting.
So that's what they did. Yeah, it's really very interesting organization and a very, as I say, very direct and tangible way of putting the idea of human rights into reality on the ground. So we went to Guatemala to learn Spanish, and then wanted to go to Colombia because there was a project that Peace Brigades had at Colombia, which at that time was still in civil war. But turned out that in Guatemala, there was a need for that work as well. I knew very little about the country before going there. Got a massive life education, historical, political education going there because the language school I went to didn't want to teach students just simply about the Spanish language, but also about the reality of the country and the history of the country and why there was features such as entrenched poverty and increased, migration upwards to Mexico and into the United States, and all these, these big things. Why were they taking place? So I didn't just get an education in Spanish language. I got an education in, the whole history of Central America
Mm.
and Guatemala in particular. And at that time in the year 2000, Guatemala had recently exited its 36 years of internal armed conflict. And the first part of the peace accords that were being implemented were exhumations of all the mass graves because the Guatemalan military in the years 1978 to 82, 83 actually implemented a brutal counterinsurgency strategy called Scorched Earth, Tierra Arrasada,
I remember.
which led to the,
I spent a bit of time in
yeah,
Guatemala, I think in the
yeah, it was
1990s, and I remember reading about the history of that. It was pretty
right,
horrendous, right?
terrible, absolutely appalling. And so all these mass graves were around the country. And so the first part of the peace accords was to exhume those mass graves in the first instance so that survivors could actually, move forward with their grieving process and move to some sense of closure because they'd be able to provide their loved ones with a dignified burial. But for the ex-military, the last thing they wanted was those bones being dug up
Yeah.
because they were all, evidence of their crimes against humanity and genocide, as it was later ruled to be. So, so we never actually went to Colombia. We ended up staying in Guatemala and doing, that work for a year. And then we ended up working with human rights organizations in Guatemala, Chiapas, and southern Mexico and Honduras, and doing several years of human rights capacity building workshops, and that again was a privilege for me to meet some, very brave leaders of these grassroots Indigenous and peasant organisations. And I went back to study then in Guatemala, did a master's in international and community development, um, and then came back to Australia with my young family at the end of 2006. And that's where I decided to do the PhD on food sovereignty as a global small farmer Indigenous peoples movement that was about trying to reorient the global agricultural and food system from one that was really about maximizing corporate profit to
Mm.
one that was about flourishing people and ecosystems. And that's been my journey ever since, I guess. So those very formative years in Guatemala. The book, actually, it was a book that really was central in this story for me. Was called Bitter Fruit: The Untold Story of the CIA Coup in Guatemala, which was looking at the history back into the early 1950s when Guatemala had its brief democratic spring, as it was called,
Mm.
and the government at that time in Guatemala was actually trying to achieve a land reform process to modernize the country in the way that Japan and Korea had done by breaking up big feudal land holdings and redistributing that land to the poor indigenous majority to give them an opportunity at a decent life and to be food secure. But in doing that in Guatemala, it came smack into the power of the United Fruit Corporation, the banana company. That's why they speak about banana
Yes.
republics because this corporation in Honduras and Guatemala in the first decades of the 20th century had tremendous control over the economy and the politics of those countries. So unfortunately for the people of Guatemala, the idea that it could modernize and embark on a land reform program was deemed unacceptable to the interests of the corporation. They had links with the Eisenhower White House, and they said, there's a terrible threat to the national security of the United States going on. The communists have taken power in Guatemala. If we don't do anything, the Soviet Union will be sticking missiles down there and threatening our national security. Therefore, it's a regime change operation. They carried out a coup d'etat in 1954, and a few years later, the country plunged into 36 years of war, which the trauma is continuing and will continue for decades. There's no functioning legal system. The rates of violence against women are off the charts. Waves of migrants, pouring northwards to Mexico and the United States. Gangs controlling large parts of the city. So it was, yeah, I guess for me, it made me so angry
Mm.
that a country was simply trying to have a chance at its own sovereignty and independence and actually rule itself for the benefit of its people and it was like a candle that was snuffed out at that moment because the powers that be in the global empire decided it was impermissible that they could be allowed to do that, and yeah, the violence and the suffering that was unleashed as a result is heartbreaking. And I guess, yeah, for me, that's what I've kind of brought into my work around food and agricultural systems. That um, we have every opportunity in this world for everyone to to live well and to eat well, but where we're not being able to fulfill that potential because the the systems and the major decisions are really being taken to benefit in the case of the food system, a small number of very powerful corporate interests who have got no real concern about our health and well-being. I mean, if we turn now to Australia in 2025, and I know you've talked about this, the food that we're being fed, the food that's being promoted and discounted and marketed to our children is making it's slowly killing us really, and diminishing our quality of life, and it's all simply to fill the coffers of these powerful corporations.
I read a stat, Nick, the other week, and I need to dig into it just to find out the validity of it. But it was from Dr. Chris Van Hoosen, I think, one of the guys in the States who writes all about ultra processed food. He said that 75% of calories consumed in the world are created by 6 corporations.
Mm.
Like
Yep,
I mean, anybody who hears that, you just could not help but to be alarmed at that 6 companies are actually responsible for the creation of 75% of calories that we all eat. And these
mm,
companies that their major thing is to drive returns to shareholders, right? So they are always going to put
that's right,
profit above everything else, and they're just.
of course.
But it's very interesting to hear the whole history around the banana republic. I wasn't familiar that was the term. That was where the term actually came from, and not surprising that a corporation would then
Mm,
use the idea of communism to get the United States and the CIA on board. And look, anybody who's traveled in Central South America just knows and has read about the history, knows that the CIA have done all sorts of horrendous things throughout that region, and now you have a look at the ramifications, and it's just it's crazy. But anyway, that's a whole nother podcast. Um, Actually, just reminds me, anybody who's interested in this subject should actually read a book. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
oh yeah, yeah,
A-
yeah,
And
absolutely. No, it's a
and
fantastic
it
book.
is a
Yeah.
ridiculous eye opener, isn't it, about what goes on behind the scenes with these big, well, with interests, international interests, and how basically money is used to control other nations. And anyway, I highly recommend that people go and read that book.
Yeah, no, it's a absolutely fantastic book. John Perkins. I mean, it's
That's
a
the guy.
real sort of whistleblower's tale, isn't it?
Yes, it
Because he
is.
was inside the belly of the beast, and it's yeah, from his personal experience actually. Yeah, he described himself as an economic hitman, and if their financial and economic levers didn't get the trick done, then they would call the jackals, as he put it. The jackals would come in after the economic hitmen tried to do the job but couldn't get it done, and the jackals, of course, being the CIA
Mm.
and their local paramilitary outfits.
And it's quite interesting now, and look, we will get back onto the topic, but it does bring up that interesting point. I mean, this whole, I think the Chinese Belt Road Initiative is doing similar things from a point of view of lending big amounts of money to underdeveloped nations who will probably end up defaulting on that, or they'll own their ports and all of this sort of thing. It's a kind of similar-ish playbook that the
Mm.
Americans were doing 30, 40 years ago. But anyway, we digress. Let's get back and talk about food. So you came to Australia and studied there. Now, talk to our listeners about, just give them a sense of how the food system actually works, because I've become increasingly concerned about a small handful of retailers here in Australia selling most of our foods, and two of them, Woolworths and Coles. So for our overseas listeners, excuse, but there's two major supermarkets here that sell most of the food, and then there's a few other chains that are smaller than that, and a lot of smaller grocery stores and butchers and bakers are actually being crowded out. And so just talk about what are some of the issues, the systemic issues, um, with that sort of a system, and also use that to give our listeners a bit of an overview of the overall food network, because I don't think a lot of people think about where the food comes from, what the politics is, all of this sort of stuff.
No, absolutely right. So I think the subject that you raised in that introduction is a good place to start, because I don't think we can have a serious conversation about the Australian food and agricultural system if we don't talk about the supermarkets. They are far and away the most powerful actors in the system. And in Australia, we say that we have a duopoly.
Yeah.
So that's, two corporations, you've mentioned them, Coles and Woolworths, that between them hold somewhere around 67 to 70% of the total grocery market in this country.
Wow.
That's up from around 35 to 40% 50 years ago.
Wow.
So they are the dominant actors, and they set the prices. They set the prices for our farmers, and they also, of course, set the prices for the consumers. And with the farmers, I've spoken to vegetable producers in different places around Melbourne over the last, 10 years, 15 years. I've been doing this work, and some of them say that they are getting the same prices that they got back in the 1980s.
Wow.
Like the price they're getting for their product has not moved, yet the costs of doing business, the wages, the energy, the inputs, the water, the land, et cetera, has obviously gone up dramatically. And CSIRO, and this was at the end of the 1990s. I don't know that they've updated these figures, but they were looking at the overall picture of Australian agriculture at the end of the 1990s, and the figure that always just has always stayed with me is that Australian farmers at the end of the 1990s needed to produce 4 times the volume to earn, in real terms, just over half of what they had done 50 years
You're
earlier in the
kidding.
1950s.
You are kidding.
Yeah, so just think about that in terms of like an insane treadmill of production where you're just running faster and faster in terms of production and going backwards. Like you're losing money. So how that is, fair, how it's sustainable, how it's ethical, how it's the foundation of a decent agricultural and food system in this country is, just beggars
Mm.
belief. But that's and yet farmers, are still operating under those kinds of terms. So that's I think a good place to start. And then if we look at consumers, we've all heard talk in this country, and I think it's true around the world as well, about the cost of living crisis, the inflation that we've experienced since COVID. Uh, in Australia, we've seen our housing costs go up dramatically if we're paying a mortgage or renting with all these interest rate rises, as well as the inflation. So
Hmm.
that's all been happening, and the supermarkets have been making record profits
Yeah.
during these years. So a lot of people are very unhappy about that, and they're saying, well, why should we, all of us as wage earners and mortgage payers and renters, be doing it so damn tough? Well, over here, these two are just raking in, billion-dollar profits year after year after year. It's not right. So that's actually led to a number of inquiries that have taken place and demands for some serious action to be taken. I don't think it's gone anywhere near far enough. I think we've got a long way to go to redress the massive power imbalance that exists in the Australian food system. And the other thing, and you've mentioned, we've touched on this briefly already, in terms of the food that you actually now can buy in a supermarket. You know, the George Institutes of Public Health in Sydney has documented that well over half of it is now ultra processed or
Yep.
discretionary. So people think in a suburb or a neighborhood, okay, we've got healthy food because we've got a supermarket down the road. But if you actually go into the supermarket and see what the food is that's available, far and away the majority of it is not healthy, and all that so much of that ultra processed and unhealthy food is what's discounted
Yes.
and marketed. It's always at the end of the checkout aisle. The cartons of Coca-Cola, it's always buy one, get the second one for 40%
Yep.
off or half price. It's there's just no controls on that. They've got an open season to as market and promote and discount these products as wherever they want to children without restraint. And this is why we're seeing, the massive public health crisis that we are in this country. So all these things come together in the supermarkets. And as you also said, in terms of the urban environment and the spatial environment, they are crowding out high street
Yep.
businesses. There's something called land banking, where if a new suburb's going to be built, they kind of go in there, they snap up the prime sites, they keep competitors out, and they make it very difficult for locally owned businesses to operate. And that's a real problem in terms of a workably competitive market, in terms of proper choice for consumers, in terms of fair market alternatives for producers, and in terms of affordable access to good food. And we demonstrated this ourselves in the 2025 federal election by going to a local greengrocer, a locally owned greengrocer in Sunshine in Melbourne's West, spent $100 mainly on fresh produce, took that same shopping list with those same weights of produce that we'd spent at Gasco's, the local greengrocer, went to the local Woolworths in Sunshine, had to spend $125 to get the same
Wow.
shopping list full. And the differential on some items was stark. Bananas were 2.5 times more expensive at Woolworths. Roma tomatoes were 4 times more expensive. Lemongrass was 10 times more expensive.
Jesus.
Garlic was 3 times more expensive. Like it was eye-wateringly uh, stark, the differences between the price. So we're actually, as part of our commitment as a healthy and sustainable food systems organisation, a health promotion charity, with our partners, we've actually got a bit of funding to go and replicate this research with groups of students from Monash University and RMIT in different parts around the northern and western suburbs of Melbourne, as well as further out in Victoria's west over the next few months. And we will be doing these price comparisons and having a list of fruit and veg and doing the comparisons between local greengrocers and the supermarkets, because our assumption is that in many cases, particularly in low income neighbourhoods, it's the local businesses that will be cheaper. But people don't think of it like that.
Yeah.
When they think about food and where you get your food, oh, it's you just go to the supermarket. Like that's just,
Yeah.
the default. We're wanting to challenge that assumption and also make the point that these locally run businesses are essential to the fabric of a diverse and connected and healthy neighborhood and suburb. And if anything, we need incentives and support to bring more greengrocers,
Yep.
more cultural grocers, more of these locally owned businesses back into our neighborhoods. We've got to start saying, look, enough of the supermarkets. They've had it really good for 50 years. It's time to kind of say, no, we don't need any more supermarkets. We actually need more locally owned businesses and greengrocers, because they are the ones that are not accountable to massive institutional shareholders and their profit expectations like hedge funds and so on. They actually will create local jobs for local people. They'll support local farmers where they can, and they'll give a fair price to their customers. And particularly in culturally diverse areas, they will provide a much better range of the types of veg and fruit.
Not to mention, Nick, being a shitload fresher than the stuff that you get in the supermarkets as well,
Correct.
right? I just want to add.
That's it. And not wrapped in plastic.
Yes, not yeah, exactly. And I want to add something to this, just from some personal observation. So I did a bunch of work, and it was in New Zealand, but I think they've got a very similar system here. And I was working with a big food producer. I won't name them. I was working with their leadership team, and they had a problem in that they create a lot of baked goods. And one of the biggest supermarket came to them and said, we want you to produce for us a dollar white loaf that will be a supermarket own brand, right? And that dollar white loaf
Hmm.
that they wanted to produce, it was going to cost them more to make it. But they said to them, if you will produce that white loaf for us that we will brand as the supermarket one, we will then give you preferred shelf space for your major products.
Hmm.
And if you don't, we will go to
Hmm.
your competition and we'll do the deal with the competition. So the leadership team were wrangling about how much money they were going to lose on giving a supermarket their bread that they could brand as their own, and to then be able to
Yep.
have their products put in the primary position, at the end of the aisles, and these things at eye level, all of this sort of stuff. So all the stuff that you're
Yep.
buying in the supermarkets that is, and it doesn't matter whether it's this country or another country, or Woolworths home brand or Coles home brand, they're not making it. They're going in and they're screwing the
No.
thumb screws of the people who are making it, and to do deals with them so that they can get more profits on their home brand stuff. Right. This is the sort of subterfuge
Exactly.
that goes on with these supermarkets. And I think the other point, Nick, was the farmers who are being increasingly screwed. If they don't do the deal with Coles and supermarkets, where are they going to sell their product to? Because trying to get it to the local greengrocer or whatever, or particularly if you're a dairy farmer, trying to get those other channels that you can sell it, is crazy. And I know farmers who've just shut up shop because they're going, this has just become far too difficult. And to your point,
Exactly. Exactly, Paul.
completely
That's
unsustainable, right?
exactly. It is. Yeah, it is. It's a food system that is driven by the short-term profit interests of these big corporations, and the consequences for us and for our future and future generations are just not. They're not factoring into their thinking. And I guess to just kind of go back to your original question about the food system and the reason to kind of like make these connections and see the bigger picture. Part of the crisis in the Australian food system is with the demographic change in farmers and the fact that so many farmers, I think the average age of farmers in Australia now is over 60. Many of them are over 70, and young people are not going into
Yeah.
agriculture for the reasons that we've been discussing because it's seen as a mug's game. It's just really hard work with little reward, and they're just not feeling supported, and that's a problem. That is a huge problem, and it's not just this country. There's been similar. I think there's a protest in the UK at the moment it's the same thing. It's like, where's your food if you don't have
Yeah, well,
farmers? I mean,
that's the point,
the
right?
soil, the soil and the water is the foundation of the food system, but we need labor, we need farmers to grow the food. And if we don't have them, and they're being so screwed over by the current system, it's a disaster for us that is going to come round and bite us, really, really quickly. So I think the numbers of farmers under the age of 35 in Australia is now down to about 12 or 13%. It was about 30%
Wow.
20 years ago. So there's a massive generational issue in how do we incentivize and encourage and enable and support the next generation of farmers and young people into agriculture, and we can, if we have time, we can touch on this in your local context in Mornington, because they're one of the few local councils in Australia that are really trying to do this well and tackle this issue through their food economy and agroecology strategy and their producer food economy task force that's working with the local government that's actually looking at this question amongst others. And one of the other questions that they're looking at is is the question of sustainability and caring for the land,
Mm,
and supporting farmers to make the transition away from highly destructive, chemical intensive forms of land management and agriculture that have devastated this country, in so many places, and so much so that Australia, after invasion and colonization in 1788, has the highest rate of biodiversity loss and species extinction on the planet. And the principal reason for that is agriculture and the massive land use change that it's brought about. So that's another dimension of the food and agricultural system that most of us, because we're so urbanized, we're one of the most urbanized countries in the world. We just, most of us don't know a farmer
yeah.
now, and we don't really spend much time going out. We don't go out there to the countryside, or where wheat and the sheep and the cattle are raised. If we go on holiday, we tend to go to the coast, or we get in a plane and go somewhere else. We don't have a lot of connection with our own country. So these issues, we don't think about them. Our interaction with the food
Mm,
system is through what's on the shelf at the supermarket, and that's it. And we look at the price, and maybe we look at the label, and maybe we think about organic, and maybe we think about fair trade and some of these things. But these bigger issues, these structural issues and problems, are just out of mind, out of sight. So in my teaching in the food studies degree, I have an assignment for my students called commodity chain analysis, which is helping them to think critically back through the whole chain in the food system to actually understand where the food comes from and what the conditions of production actually are, and what all the consequences of those relationships entail. So we look at coffee, for example, and the conditions of the coffee producers
mm,
in countries like Guatemala and Honduras, and how that product that gets from Honduras, let's say, to a cafe in Brunswick or North Melbourne, and who's benefiting from that $6 you're paying for your latte or your flat white, and all the complexities. It's a big and important topic, but I think it's something that we need to be discussing more, because these issues affect all of
yeah.
us. Like, all of us eat. All of us are impacted by what's happening with our soils, with our waterways, with the climate. We can't pretend that this is somebody else's problem
No, that's
and
right.
for someone else to
And
remedy. We're all
if you
involved.
don't want to be eating lab grown food when you're old, and don't want your grandchildren to be eating mostly lab grown food, we need to do something about it now. So let
That's it. Well, that's it. And exactly.
let's pivot. Let's
Go.
pivot to talk about what we can do. So two topics here. What can the individual do? All the listeners, what can they do, just from a purchasing perspective, from having your own garden? Then what can communities do? And then what's the big stuff that you're doing with advocacy groups and trying to influence people? So pick any of those three. But I remember reading in about lockdown. One of the benefits of lockdown, um, I remember seeing in the UK and all these kind of gardens popping up in the what do they call them, the allotments, right? And people going and doing a lot more
Allotments. Yeah.
gardening and allotments. And I think your organization's been involved with a couple of those different projects. So maybe talk to that, and then also talk about what we can do as consumers. Like, are there some products that you're better off going? And I know things like, obviously, farmers markets, going to your local fruit and veg, going to your local butcher, those sorts of things. Maybe we'll take that first. What an individual can do from a purchasing perspective, and maybe growing your own. Then how can we put pressure on them, and what are local governments doing? And then we'll maybe talk about the big stuff that's more like people like you influencing it.
Sure. Okay. So at the individual level, let's just talk about growing some of your own food, which, according to research from the Australia Institute, more than 50% of Australians are already participating in that activity in
That's cool.
one way, shape, or form. And I think indeed it's a fair, in this sport obsessed nation that is Australia, probably the most popular activity, so-called recreational activity, is actually gardening. I think
Wow.
we're a nation of gardeners even more than we are a nation of sports mad fanatics. Um, so with so many of us are already doing this, and there's such power in that simple act of, even if it's as simple as kind of like a pot of herbs on your balcony if you're in a apartment or townhouse, to, if you've got a little bit more space, having some veggies, the skills you can learn, the satisfaction that you can derive from that creative project, that creative process is immense, because it connects you with the source of life.
Mm.
When you're doing that, you're actually tapping in to life itself, to the cycle of life, the creative process.
And Nick, sorry, just jumping
We
in,
got a glimpse. Sorry.
having just written a sort of chapter on this area in my book, spending time in nature is really good for you mentally. Gardening has been shown to be really good for your mental health and diversifies
Oh,
your
absolutely.
microbiome. Actually, working the soil diversifies your microbiome as well. And the food that you produce in your own garden is going to be a shitload more nutritious than the stuff that you buy in the supermarkets, right?
100%. Yep. Yep. All those points, Paul. Absolutely. And indeed, the mental health one is really, really important. And during COVID, my organization, Sustain, did a survey. We called it the Pandemic Gardening Survey. We had it open for 1 month from mid-June to mid-July 2020. We received over 9,000 responses to that survey, 9,140 responses from all over the country. And what people said again and again was just how important it was at that time of heightened anxiety to be able to participate in that very calming and reassuring activity of gardening, access to green space, and growing some of their own food. And I'll just give you, we had over 25,000 quotes. The survey we wrote had many open field questions, and it was a moment in time when people were at home in lockdown, and this tapped into a bit of a zeitgeist, I think, and people really engaged with it. And so we had over 20,000 long form answers that we're still kind of slowly working our way through. But here's a woman age in the 25 to 34 bracket, living in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, and she said, "Watching things grow, helping them into the world has been enormously comforting. In a year where things feel like they've been put on pause, the inexorable growth of our vegetables has been a sweet and quiet lesson in motion, a sense of things carrying on." And I think that that was reflective of a sentiment of thousands of respondents to this survey, of the enormous mental health benefits of access to gardening and food growing at that time. But I think it's a general statement that holds very true. So the simple act of growing some of your own food, I think, would be a really positive and empowering thing for people to do. I'm sure many of your listeners already do it,
Mm.
but if you haven't tried it, it's not that hard. It's just a couple of pots and some soil and some seedlings, and care and attention, and it becomes a meditative practice. I think it became become a and it was a daily ritual for people who are answering this survey. So that would be, I guess, the first thing in terms of
Nick, sorry,
shopping.
I would
Sorry.
just add to that. Actually, the in the island of Okinawa in Japan, um, I had interviewed a professor Ken Mogi, and it's known as one of the centers for longevity. And there's I think there's been few misrepresentations about why. Ken Mogi was saying a lot of the older people there, they have an icky guy of growing their own food. Right, that is this ikigai, that Japanese, what gets you up in the morning, and it's when they have been surveyed, they say that gives them the joy to be able to grow their own food and to eat their own food and eat it as a community. That's a huge reason why they are much longer lived, and we have actually started doing it more, Carly, but I've actually started getting into it, and we're actually now expanding out of the herbs and the strawberries and those sorts of things, and about to get a greenhouse because we have actually felt the benefits of it, and it's a mindful activity. You know, it is one of those ikigai. So I echo everything that lady said in the quote.
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you mentioned joy and pleasure because that's really important as well. And I think that's something that we've perhaps lost touch with in Australia, in our culture where everything's so much about, material things and consumption and, career progress and, financial, all the metrics, both for ourselves as individuals, but for our society. It's so instrumentalized and so, reduced to, financial metrics that we've lost. I think in some ways we've lost touch with the more, spiritual, foundational elements of life that are really what gives life meaning and purpose. And
Mm.
the joy of gardening is a really important aspect of that. And I'll just briefly share with you another aspect of this, um, another quote, and we've just, my co-author Kelly Donati and I have just had this chapter published in a book about this. Um, the joy that people derived in so many different ways from being able to garden, not just growing the food, but observing the interactions of other
Mm.
creatures in the garden. So observing bees feeding in the garden was a particular source of joy for some. And this person said, watching all the native bees going crazy over my pineapple sage makes me happier and more content than you could believe.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's just really, it seems such a small thing, but I think it's really, there's so much beauty and power in that where you can, by having that flowering plant, you're giving food to others, to other creatures. You're nourishing them, but you're nourishing yourself spiritually and mentally as well, simply by creating that beauty, those aesthetics, and then being able to go out there and see the bees, do what they do, and just lose yourself in that moment. It's really
And Nick, it's a
really
little
powerful.
moment
So
where we can have a positive contribution to the ecosystem of the earth and try to offset some
exactly,
of our obvious destruction just by having to exist, you know, by not
yeah,
intentionally, but just all the things that we do, the things that we consume are probably net negative for the ecosystem of the earth. So if you can just balance it that little bit and get a bonus for your mental health, a bonus for your physical health as well, and take some money out of the friggin' supermarket's pockets, then it's got to be a win-win all round, right?
100%. Yep, no, 100%, Paul. Okay, so from gardening, then obviously, most of us are going to get most of our food not from what we grow ourselves, but from what we
Yeah.
purchase. And I think we've already talked about this. I mean, every purchasing decision that you can make, which doesn't involve the supermarket duopoly, is a good decision, I think. And if you can support your local farmer, be it at your local farmers market or there are direct ways of doing that in some parts of the city. But even just going to a locally owned business, a locally owned greengrocer, of which there are still plenty around the city if you do look for them. I think that's a really positive thing to do. Support your locally owned businesses. They're family-run businesses. They're
Yeah.
not being accountable to remote shareholders. They're not driven by profit maximization. They're there for reasons of passion. They're running that business because it's been in their family or it's what they're passionate about. And if we can get behind them and support them, I think those are all really good things that we can do on a daily and weekly basis. All right, so those from individuals then to at the community level. Community gardens, if you, again, to going back to growing food and participating in those kinds of activities, if you do want to get into it more seriously, participating in the community garden is a great thing to do. It's, one of the other crises that we're facing, as I'm sure you know, is
Yeah.
loneliness
Yeah.
and social isolation. That has been a real feature in the way our economy, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, has developed in these decades of neoliberalism. It's, people have become atomized and isolated and lonely, and that's another reason why mental health and stress are such a, such big, big problems in society. So, uh, that they've said that, the so-called third spaces that we used to have, decades ago in our towns and cities have disappeared and vanished, and we only have kind of, constructed, commodified opportunities to gather together in collectivities at, commercial sport and the like. So community gardens are one of those third spaces where it's not about money, it's not about a commodified commercial experience. It's simply people joining together because they're interested in pursuing this activity together, and there's an opportunity to learn and socialize in a relaxed, pleasing way, and it's a great form of light exercise. And I know that you've spoken about this, the benefits of physical activity and how important that is for your mental health and your bodily health. So, so that's a really good thing to do. If you've got children, if you've got families and schools, to support them to get a garden happening at the school if they don't already have one, is a really
You
important thing
just
to do
took the words
because
out of my mouth, actually. I did some work with a specialist school. It was a bunch of principals, and they were for specialist schools. So these are the teachers that, geez, they do the hard yakka. And because of the talk that I did, one of the principals at one of the schools, and they then brought me back in to show me everything. They completely changed their canteen. They stopped selling chips and crappy food, and they said that the students, they were young. It was a primary school. The students were almost revolting, but they got the students involved. With growing a lot of the food that they then sold into the tuck shop. And so the students then were eating their own food. And a lot of these kids had disabilities, whether it was physical or intellectual disabilities. And he said the change in the students after that first bit of resistance was just amazing. So I fully
yep.
endorse that, as parents, if you know a parent on the committee, just harass them or get on the committee and just harass the well-being people in the school to say, if you don't have a
Yep.
garden, let's get a garden. Let's get the kids involved in it. Let's get them having an understanding of this.
Absolutely. And there's two fantastic initiatives that have taken this to the next level in Victoria. That if you're interested, I'm happy to put you in touch with them. One is called Farm Raiser, and that's a special development school in Belfield in West Heidelberg. And that they these are and this was the initiative of three students graduating from Melbourne University's grad in urban horticulture a few years ago. They
And that is bloody awesome. Though the stuff that's going in those three schools. So if you're a parent, go and harass your school, or politely suggest that they might want to do something like this. So what then about local government? What sort of local government initiatives are going on that can be helpful here?
Yeah, that's a great question, and just want to say one of the reasons why I love working in this space and doing this work is because there's so many great things happening. Like it's such a creative, energizing space. There's so much positivity and good people doing amazing work for the very best of reasons. And that's another reason, to get involved. In terms of local government, they have a really important role to play in this space, not least because they manage land, and they can make that land available for people to do activities such as urban farms and community gardens, and we ourselves benefit from that. In the city of Darebin, we've been running an urban farm on what used to be called the Melbourne Innovation Centre at Alphington. This, interestingly, was one of Melbourne's most contaminated and polluted sites. It was an ex-landfill that was capped I think about 30 or 40 years ago. And now it's become a bit of an urban agri-food hub with a weekly farmers market, with two women growing oyster mushrooms in shipping containers, with the urban farm that we're
Wow.
running. Yeah, and with a waste business, Reground, a social enterprise that provides waste auditing services to the hospitality sector and takes away coffee grounds and donates them to community gardens. So it's a little cluster of food related activities, and it's all land owned by the city of Darebin. So they make that space available for all these social enterprises and organisations to do this work. And for us, also up at Bundura Park Farm, which is one of Melbourne's original farms post colonisation, we have had a license from Darebin Council, half an acre of land up there for the past 2 years, and we have used that to create a First Nations food, fibre and medicine garden on one paddock, and on the adjacent paddock a more traditional European style market garden. The First Nations food, fibre and market garden has been such a satisfying project. Through some of the philanthropic funding we've had, we've been able to employ a Yorta Yorta woman, an artist and musician, who did one of our rounds of paid internships. She loves doing that work, and she's now leading a group of 8 First Nations people in a 10-week paid internship that we're commencing next week, which will be helping them to recover uh, connection to country, recovery of cultural knowledge, the plants that were grown here pre-colonisation, to visit other First Nations run sites around the city, and to build that sense of community and connection. And we've also got a yarning circle and a fire pit, for smoking ceremonies up there at that site. So that's all been made possible
That is
by
so
the,
cool.
yeah, no, it's really exciting and fantastic, and it's been supported by the city of Darebin in making that land available to us at a pretty favourable rate. So those are the kinds of things that local governments can do. They can also bring community together and start have the kinds of conversations you and I have been having, creating spaces for communities to have them with each other about these issues. So we've been part of that process ourselves many times, going back to 2016 with Cardinia Shire Council and the creation of the Cardinia Community Food Strategy that we helped facilitate with, I think it was about 50 small group talks, kitchen table conversations, people sitting around a table having these kinds of discussions, that being documented, and all those inputs going into writing up the council community food strategy, to the city of Banyule in 2022-23 when we supported them to engage with over 600 local residents and create the city of Banyule's first urban food strategy, to Mornington Peninsula Shire Council's food economy and agroecology strategy, which is being driven by council by the agribusiness officer Sarah Saxton, to work with local producers and help them make the shift to sustainable and regenerative forms of food production on the peninsula. So, those are just a handful of examples. We've been working with local governments ourselves for the better part of 10 years now, and can see the difference it makes when they actually understand these issues and really work with and get behind community members, to put some cohesion and longer term vision and strategies and goals around this work. So that's local. Now, state government and federal government obviously
And
have.
presumably, Nick, sorry, before you get on to state and federal, presumably, individuals like me will have more of an impact going and talking to the local government than they
Absolutely.
would state and federal government.
Yeah, because exactly,
Yeah,
you're
I
right.
thought so.
Yeah, because they're much more accessible. It's much,
Yeah.
they're the closest level of government to people, to communities. Anyone can go along to council meetings. You can seek meetings with your mayor and your councillors, and involve yourself in the process. And I guess, for me, coming back to what I said at the start in terms of my entry point into this whole area, it's also about breathing life back into our democratic culture, because I feel that is also part of the crisis that we're facing. We've become very cynical and jaded about politics, about government, about how these decisions are made, with with perfectly good reason, because we can see that the decisions are not being made in our interests. But despair is not the answer. And I think, a lot of people would be very happy if more and more people did just throw up their hands in despair and say, well, it's all hopeless and, there's nothing we can
Mm.
do. Because if that's the attitude that we take and we don't do anything, then nothing will ever change, and it will only get worse. It's only,
Yeah.
I think, by embracing the antithesis of despair, which is hope, and saying that what happens next, both in my own life but in broader social life, is up to us. Really, it's we need to be the agents of change ourselves and be active and be engaged and involving ourselves at the local level with processes like creating food strategies is a good place to start. So at the state
Yeah,
level,
absolutely.
and federal level, we need the state government to get engaged. Like we've talked about the ultra processed food industry, the burden of chronic disease. A big part of the problem is that in the Victorian planning provisions, the word health is not mentioned, the word well-being is not mentioned, and the phrase food security is not mentioned. And that means that the fast food industry, as long as it's in the so-called activity zone of the planning provisions, local governments have no power to stop the expansion of those businesses, and they can set up and have set up across the road from daycare centres, from early learning centres, and from schools and primary schools. Um, so this is a
And
political
that shit
question.
ain't an accident. That is not an accident, right?
No,
It's
absolutely
get them
not. Of
young, you've
course
got them
not.
for life.
Exactly, exactly. And look at how look at how they market and promote their products, what audience they're targeting, right? It's kids, it's young kids.
Yeah.
This is wrong. If we're concerned about health and well-being of our city, of our country, we cannot let this industry, which does not care about health and well-being, it cares about its bottom line, it cares about its profits, just to have carte blanche to expand wherever and whenever it wants. But to change this, we actually have to get involved in the political process. So we did that. My organisation met with politicians in 2023. That led to the establishment of two food security inquiries in the Victorian Parliament last year, one looking at the mental and dietary impacts of food poverty and food health in Victoria, as well as what can be done to expand
Oh,
affordable
wow.
access to good food. And the second one was looking at securing Victoria's food supply and the impacts of population growth and urban sprawl on food security. So both those committees, and we gave evidence, we made submissions, we encouraged others to give evidence. Those committees reported in November last year quite ambitious recommendations. They talked about legislating the human right to good food for all in Victoria. They talked about a Victorian food system strategy. They talked about changing the planning provisions, as I just mentioned, a whole raft of things, like a really solid reform agenda for the Victorian government. Unfortunately, the Victorian government not the week before last, issued its report to those recommendations, which um, was very underwhelming, to be frank. They did not embrace an ambitious reform agenda. They said, "Well, we're already doing these kinds of things. We're already giving a lot of money to food bank. We've got it covered. We don't, we'll look at some of these things maybe later on down the line and see if we think it needs to be done." So that's disappointing. I'm not saying, well, that's end of story. We're coming into an election next year in Victoria. This T-shirt that I've got on, I vote for food. Like
Yeah.
we have got a campaign that we want to run, where we want candidates and sitting members to sign our pledge. There's 5 elements of our Vote for Food pledge, and we can share this link with your viewers later, that are calling for a healthy and fair food system that prioritises human and ecological health as the top priorities. And we want our politicians to sign up to that. We think that's what they should be doing as our representatives. So that's the campaign that we'll be running going into the
Did you
2026
consider, Nick?
Victorian election.
Sorry, I love that. I love that you're getting into the election. Did you and your group ever consider creating a political party?
uh, it's funny you should say that, because one of my staff members, who comes from a farming family, is a Kiwi, and he's going back there next year. has actually, yeah, thrown. That's the path he's going down. He's saying, you've got to get in there and roll your sleeves up and get in the political process if you want change. So he's doing that. I have not gone down that path yet, but we are building. We're trying to build a mass membership. That's the next phase of our
Yeah.
work. We've got a digital platform called the Australian Food Network, where we're wanting to bring together people all around the country who care about these things and who want to find other people who care about them and who want to share these kinds of stories I've been talking about, stories of inspiration and hope, and to work together. So if we can start to build some membership, we've got about 250, 300 so far. If we can get that, up over 1,000 and beyond, then yeah, quite possibly. I think it's something that's definitely worth considering. Um, Definitely worth considering. But I just wanted to finish perhaps with this discussion about bigger picture change and policy to talk about the federal government because obviously they're the biggest
Yes.
resource. They've got where most of the money is. They could do things like put a super profits tax on the supermarket and invest in urban farms and community gardens and school gardens. They could use that money to invest in universal school meals, which other countries have done. That's where the dial can really be shifted. So we have an opportunity right now because as part of our Vote for Food campaign, we called on the federal government to commit to a national food security strategy. And that's what the Albanese government did in March. They said they were going to create the Feeding Australia strategy, it's called. So now we're expecting them later this month or in September to make the first announcements about what that process is going to be and where it's going to go forward. So we've been meeting with the bureaucrats, the food policy team at DAF, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries. We have been saying to them, this has to be a participatory process. You cannot say, okay, we've allocated 3.5 million of federal money to develop this strategy. We're just going to chuck that to PricewaterhouseCoopers or somebody like that, lock them in a room with Coles and Woolworths and the Australian Food and Grocery Council and write up a strategy that's all about, the interest of the big end of town. It needs to be open, it needs to be participatory, it needs to be inclusive, it needs to prioritise our First Nations communities, and it needs to prioritise the people who are living with food poverty and food insecurity, because that should be the priority of a national food security strategy. So that's what we've been saying to them. That's what
Mm.
we expect them to do. And it's an open invitation to work with people around the country to involve ourselves in this process. And we've got, some ideas and approaches about how we might take that forward. But that's going to be starting, quite soon.
Bloody awesome. Nick, this has been a very eye-opening podcast that I think affects everybody. Whether you're an Australian listener or you're not an Australian listener, I mean, I would imagine we could look at many developed nations and the same systemic issues would be present in those nations. So, look, there's take homes here for individuals, but if they want to assist you in your really important work, what sort of things should they be doing? There's the Australian Food Network. Presumably, they can go and join that, and we'll put all the links into the show notes. But what would you like those who are concerned citizens who go, actually, I want to do something about this, even if it is just giving my support to the people who are actually taking the action?
Yep.
How can we help?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned citizens because that is something that we're talking about here. Food citizenship, food democracy. Like let's get involved. If we want to change the food system, we have to get involved in shaping it, and that means inhabiting our identity as citizens, as participants in this polity that we call Australia. So I would say join us. You can become a member. We'll share the link. It's $60 a year, and that will connect you to the Australian Food Network platform, where you'll be meeting hundreds of people around the country who are also on this journey, who've been working in their own communities in different ways for many, many years. We have monthly webinars, or we call it Skill of the Month, where people can learn and understand different aspects of the food system and how to change it. We've got the Vote for Food campaign that will be ongoing. So that will also be a link, and you can sign the pledge and add your name to support the Vote for Food pledge. Those would probably be the two, I guess, the two main calls to action. Consider becoming a member of Sustain and sign the Vote for Food pledge. Join the Australian Food Network, and find your fellows, your fellow companions in your local communities, and get involved. There's so many different entry points to this, so many different ways to be involved. And as I said, it's such a positive and empowering space to be in so many ways. So yeah, today, seize the
Yeah,
moment and
and
act.
and I would add into, yeah, absolutely, and give up 10 minutes of your time and take the extra trip to the local greengrocer and butcher
100%,
rather than just the supermarket.
100%.
Awesome, Nick. This has been great. Thank you. I tip my hat to you, sir. You're doing purposeful work. Keep going, keep building that steam up because it's important stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and yeah, thank you for giving me the time to share some of my story and why I do this work. And it really, it's the important work. I think, as Wendell Berry said, this is part of the great work that all of
Mm.
us alive today are engaged in. Like, I think all of us have to ask the question, why are we alive? Why are we here? And for me, it is to try and make the positive change that I can with the experience and skills and capacities and energy that I have. And yeah, it's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you about it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, mate.